Thank you, Sir David, and thank you to the Governor Rocker for a very interesting and very passionate beginning of this evening. I might be a little bit less passionate, but I hope I still can convey some things of interest to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to be here this evening, representing the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative, and to present our views on the need for a global payment scheme for a vital ecosystem service, the carbon storage provided by the world's tropical forest. I will also focus on the strong linkages between climate change mitigation efforts and protection of biodiversity and ecosystem services. I only have 10 slides, so I think I'll pace them out a little bit. Chico Mendes, the Brazilian activist, once said, "At first I thought I was fighting to save the rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I'm fighting for humanity." His words are a vivid illustration on why it is so important to protect the world's forest. The Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative began its work in April 2008. Our main purpose is to support action to reduce emissions of carbon to the atmosphere caused by deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, also known as REDD+. Depletion of the carbon storage in forest is estimated to account for about 17% of annual man-made greenhouse gas emissions. As I'm sure you all know, the Stern Review and other studies have identified reduction of these emissions as one of the most cost-effective and rapidly available large-scale mitigation options. And reducing emissions from forest destruction is essential if we are to reach the target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. This is why we welcome the agreement on a REDD+ mechanism on the Climate Change Convention in Cancun last year. It was an important step forward, but several important issues remain unresolved, not least the question of medium and long-term financing. Conserving the world's forest is not going to be easy, and we need to be aware that it means much more than improving forest management. It is a fundamental development choice that will have implications for all sectors of a society. And the Norwegian Forest and Climate Initiative is helping developing and testing mechanisms that can bring about system-level changes and help countries to make a transition to a more sustainable forest management regime. The forests are worth more as intact forest than they are converted to other use. There are powerful economic drivers behind deforestation. If we do nothing, the growing global demand for timber, palm oil, sugar, soy and beef, and the need to feed a population of 9 billion people by mid-century, where your grandson will only be at his early middle age, will continue to increase pressure on tropical forests. But business as usual is not an option. The consequences will simply be devastating. In the past, almost all countries that have achieved economic growth have done so at the expense of the natural resource base. The typical pattern in forested countries has been a high deforestation rate in the early phase of economic development, which has later slowed and ultimately been reversed. I think this is going a little bit faster than I thought, these pictures, but we'll just take them around again. They're very beautiful, so most of them are very beautiful. Some of them are pretty ugly. But as I said, the typical pattern in forested countries has been a high deforestation rate in the early phase of economic development, which has later slowed and ultimately been reversed. This pattern is called the forest transition curve, and you will find it demonstrated in most European countries, including my own Norway. Many tropical forest countries are still in the early stages of economic development. And deforestation is likely to continue and even speed up as they strive for social and economic development for the citizens. The challenge for REDD+, and indeed for any effort to conserve natural resources, is to create incentives and provide support that can assist countries to develop without destroying their forests. In other words, to leapfrog the forest transition curve. If REDD+ and the global battle to halt the biodiversity loss and ecosystem decay is to succeed, the rules must change. I think I'm now into some... so I think it's living a life of its own here. I put this away, but it didn't help. So I'm sorry, Andrew, if I catch some of your thunder here. Traditional conservation schemes that set aside areas of particular value to be preserved for the future have done a great deal of good and still have an important role to play. However, if we are to make a difference on a larger scale, we need to change the rules by which private sector money moves. To give a REDD+ mechanism credibility, payments or compensations should only be made once verifiable results have been achieved. The concept of performance-based financing differs from traditional aid schemes where need, not results, defines the level of financing. For REDD+ to succeed, funding to build capacity to measure, report and verify emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and to develop national strategies for combating deforestation and forest degradation will be needed in an initial phase. To put it simply, if we are to create a sustainable future, protecting the is to level forests and transform them into palm oil, soy or pulpwood plantations or cattle ranches, deforestation will continue. And will not succeed unless the growing demand for food, fiber and other commodities is tackled through three parallel approaches. We need to increase productivity on land that is already in use and at the same time make certain that agricultural expansion takes place in non-forest areas, preferably by restoring degraded lands. And finally, we must reduce global demand for commodities that drive deforestation, a quite tall order. If we ascribe an economic value to carbon storage services provided by forest, the economic rationale for conversion of forest for agriculture and other uses will be dramatically weakened. REDD+ can contribute significantly to making forest worth more alive than dead. At the same time, you must remember that REDD+ only assigns value to one of the many ecosystem services provided by forest. Forests purify water and regulate water flow, provide flood control and reduce flood damage. In fact, almost half the world's population depends directly on these water-related ecosystem services. And of course, many local communities, including indigenous communities, are directly dependent on forest, about 50 million people in the Congo Basin alone. If REDD+ is to succeed, all the people who depend on forest, but at present are using them in an unsustainable manner, and sometimes illegally, must be given help to find alternative, sustainable ways of life. These forests are certainly not empty, as we heard the governor say. In the Brazilian Amazon alone, 25 million people live today. Given that pressure of the world's remaining forest is likely to increase in the years ahead, it is vital to continue to explore the value of their biodiversity and ecosystem services, and to establish further incentives for the conservation. So David mentioned earlier the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, the TEEB study, that has inspired a whole range of follow-up processes, both nationally and internationally. This makes me more confident that REDD+ will only be one of the many tools used to correct the market failures that are currently leading to overconsumption of resources and destruction of many important ecosystems. The next question is, why should government and private sector actors that are focusing on the reducing carbon emissions from forest destruction turn their attention to conservation of biodiversity? Isn't there a risk that our efforts to cut emissions will be less efficient if we try to add on additional issues? Not in my opinion. I realize that there are likely to be some trade-offs between maximizing carbon benefits and conserving forest biodiversity. But there is a huge potential for positive synergies, and risk of not doing both may be far more serious, and I will give you 3 examples. There is a strong correlation between biodiversity richness and the carbon stock. That means that saving the most carbon-dense forests will also benefit biodiversity. There's also a correlation between the intactness of biodiversity and the ability of forest carbon systems to help prevent or downscale large-scale disturbances such as forest fires, drought, and disease. Maintaining intact biodiversity is therefore a way of increasing the long-term security of forest carbon storage. On the other hand, degradation of ecosystems combined with climate change may bring them to tipping points, beyond which irreversible large-scale change occurs. Several studies have indicated that the removal of as little as 20% of the Amazon rainforest could push much of the Amazon into a drier climate regime and result in large-scale dieback of the forest. All this means that government and industries investing in or implementing REDD+ activities can draw on the following conclusions. Their investments will be safer if REDD+ activities also contribute to the conservation and or restoration of forest biodiversity. Neither biodiversity nor carbon is evenly distributed throughout ecosystems. Mapping the distribution of carbon and biodiversity could make it easier to design REDD+ activities that maximize the synergy between biodiversity, the synergy with biodiversity conservation. If natural forests are converted to tree plantations, the carbon store and biodiversity will usually be reduced and should therefore be avoided. Plantations can play an important role in decreasing pressures on the forest, but only if properly located and properly managed. For the moment, we are still in a position where the fundamental economic, political, and administrative framework generally favors continued deforestation and forest degradation. Change to this will require system-level changes, which are costly in both economic and, very importantly, in political terms in forest countries. Governments will only give priority to major reforms in the direction of sustainable forest management if they are offered incentives that are in a reasonable proportion to the scale of the challenges. This year, the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative will be spending around $400 million. My government aim is for the annual payments to peak at around $500 million per year at today's exchange rates. While modest compared to the potential upsides, we are still the biggest donor in the REDD+ space. And I would argue that it is not the total amount of funding, but a strategic approach that may provide the biggest learning potential as the world strives towards sustainability in the 21st century. The most prominent recent example of anti-deforestation efforts is provided by Brazil, and as we heard from the governor of Accra earlier. Over the last 5 to 6 years, the country has reduced its deforestation rate by almost 70% compared with the average in the period 1996-2005. In Brazil, Norway is basically rewarding a job well done, paying post facto per ton for actual reductions in emissions. I think I'm being asked to maybe stop my presentation. Is that... Do I have more time, or?
You have more time.
Okay, okay, thank you. I'll continue this for a few more minutes then. Our agreement with Brazil may seem generous. We have pledged to provide Brazil with $1 billion for the period up to 2015 for verified emissions reductions, but our contribution comes nowhere near matching what the country has actually achieved. The World Resources Institute estimates that reductions in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon correspond to cutting emissions by about 850 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. This is probably the single most significant climate change mitigation effort globally over the last decade. With rising commodity prices and growing pressures on tropical forests, are fair the consequences if developing countries are unwilling to make substantial payments to reward results like the ones we see in Brazil. From a systems change perspective, I think our partnership with Indonesia is also very interesting. The partnership is based on Indonesia's own ambitions and was triggered by President Yudhoyono's speech at the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh in September 2009 in the run-up to the Copenhagen summit. Indonesia's goal is to cut emissions by 26% by 2020 compared with the business as usual level, or by 41% with international support. Norway is to pay for results, first for institution strengthening, capacity building, and the development of policy and legislation, and from no later than 2014 for verified emission reductions. Some people ask how the goal of reducing deforestation can be compatible with government's goal of continued economic growth and increased agricultural production. Indeed, this has been the focus in the public debate in both Indonesia and Brazil. Both governments argue that the goals are compatible, and we agree. Brazil, for example, has 40 million hectares of degraded land that could be used instead of clearing more forests for agricultural production. Incentives for both the public and the private sector must be tailored to the specific national context. All REDD+ activities should be embedded in national strategies and plans to combat deforestation while sustaining economic and social growth. Countries must be held accountable for nationwide results that will trigger payments. Without a national level approach, there's a serious risk that positive results from one project or one region of a country will be counteracted by increased forest destruction elsewhere. We are confident that the private sector can thrive in this new environment. It is all about finding the competitive advantage, the edge that will make your product stand out to climate-conscious consumers and clients. If the international community does not act to reduce deforestation, the world may be facing cost of $1 trillion a year by 2100 just from climate change caused by deforestation. This figure comes from models used by the Elias Review. The estimated cost of reducing deforestation by half by 2020 and halting it by 2030 is only a small fraction of this figure. It could be achieved at an annual cost of a few $1 billion next year, increasing to perhaps $50 billion per year in 2030. In other words, saving the world's remaining tropical forests is expensive, but it's still in many ways a bargain, the bargain of the century. And the bargain is not only global, the local benefits too are huge. The monetary value of steady rainfall provided by the Amazon rainforest for agriculture in South America is estimated at being between $1 and $3 billion a year. The Amazon rainforest also supports the livelihood of poor forest dwellers, such as subsistence fishing and cultivation of rubber. The value of these benefits is estimated at between $500 million and $1 billion a year. The experience and knowledge we have gained from the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative in the last 3 years shows that it's possible to make REDD work if everyone is willing to make a concerted effort to bring about systematic changes. But this requires major reform and will only be given priority if the incentives for sustainable forest management are in proportion to the scale of their challenges. Substantial funding is needed, but REDD Plus is affordable, and the cost of inaction is much, much higher. We are trying to do our part, but it's a huge task. Brazil is trying to do its part. It's also a huge task. But more and large donors are needed to be involved in this work, including businesses and government institutions in both developed and developing countries. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, thank you so much.